the 1980s, a decade that revolutionized music as we know it. But what if everything you thought you knew about 80s music was just scratching the surface?
Oh, now you've got me intrigued. What do you mean by that?
Well, we often think of the 80s as the era of big hair and synth pop, but it was so much more than that. This decade saw a seismic shift in how music was created, consumed, and marketed. Did you know that a 2010 survey by Music Choice found that the 1980s was the most favored music decade of the last 40 years?
That's fascinating. I wonder what it was about 80s music that made it so enduring. Do you think it was the diversity of genres that emerged during that time?
Absolutely. The 80s were a musical melting pot. We saw the rise of electronic dance music with genres like post disco, Italo disco, and Euro disco taking center stage. But it wasn't just about dance music. Rock was still going strong, with subgenres like soft rock, glam metal, and thrash metal carving out their own niches.
Mm-hmm. And let's not forget about the emergence of hip hop during this time. It was really starting to gain mainstream traction, wasn't it?
You're spot on. The 80s saw the beginning of what many call the golden age of hip hop. It was still primarily an urban genre, popular in inner city areas, but it was on the verge of breaking into the mainstream in a big way. And breakthrough it did. Hip hop and rap continued to rise in popularity through the 90s and 2000s. And today, they're some of the most dominant genres in popular music.
It's amazing how influential the 80s were on today's music landscape. But let's talk about the technology that made a lot of this possible. The 80s saw a huge increase in the use of digital recording and synthesizers, right?
Absolutely. The 80s were really the first time that digital technology became widely available in music production. Synthesizers and drum machines became more affordable and user friendly, which opened up new possibilities for sound creation. This led to that iconic 80s sound: the big, reverb heavy drums, the lush synth pads, the electronic bass lines. It was a complete departure from the more organic sound of the 70s.
So, how do you think this affected the role of the musician?
Well, in some ways, it democratized music production. Suddenly, you didn't need a full band to create a full sound. A skilled producer with a synthesizer and a drum machine could create an entire track. This led to the rise of the producer as a star in their own right. Think about figures like Quincy Jones or Nile Rodgers.
Hmm, that's interesting. Do you think there were any downsides to this technological revolution?
Some critics argue that the reliance on technology led to a certain homogenization of sound. There's also the argument that it reduced the importance of traditional musicianship. But I think these criticisms overlook the incredible creativity that artists brought to these new tools. Yes, anyone could use a drum machine, but it took real artistry to use it in a way that was truly compelling.
That's a fair point. It's not the tools themselves, but how they're used that really matters. So, what about the visual aspect of music in the 80s? I feel like that was a big part of the decade's impact.
Oh, absolutely. The 80s saw the rise of MTV and the music video as an art form in its own right. Suddenly, music wasn't just something you listened to, it was something you watched. Artists like Michael Jackson, Madonna, and Prince weren't just musicians anymore, they were full fledged visual artists. Their music videos were like mini movies.
Right. And that really changed how artists presented themselves, didn't it? It wasn't just about the music anymore, but about the whole package.
Exactly. The 80s set the template for how we consume music today, the emphasis on visual presentation, the idea of the musician as a brand. All of that really took off in the 80s. And it's not just about the visuals. The 80s also saw a shift in how albums were crafted. With the advent of CDs, artists had more room to experiment with longer formats.
So, if we're looking at the legacy of 80s music, it seems like it goes far beyond just the hits of the decade. How do you think these changes influence the music landscape moving forward?
Well, the influence is really far reaching. The electronic dance music scene that started in the 80s has exploded into a global phenomenon. Genres like house and techno, which were in their infancy in the 80s, now fill stadiums and drive massive music festivals around the world. And the emphasis on visual presentation? That's only become more important in the age of social media and streaming.
That makes a lot of sense. But what about the music itself? Are there any 80s songs that you think really stand the test of time?
Oh, absolutely. Songs like Purple Rain by Prince, With or Without You by U2, or Every Breath You Take by The Police. These are masterclasses in songwriting that still hold up today. And it wasn't just about the big hits. The 80s also saw the rise of alternative and indie music. Bands like The Smiths, REM, and The Cure were building devoted followings and influencing countless future musicians.
You know, it's like the 80s never really ended. The sound just keeps evolving and finding new audiences. But as we start to wrap up our discussion, I'm curious. What do you think is the most important legacy of 80s music?
Hmm. I think the most important legacy of 80s music is its spirit of innovation and its willingness to push boundaries. Whether it was through new technology, provocative visuals, or genre blending sounds, 80s music was all about breaking new ground. And that spirit of innovation continues to inspire musicians today.
Well said. It seems like the 80s were truly a pivotal decade in the history of popular music.
Absolutely. Well, folks, we've taken a whirlwind tour through the musical landscape of the 1980s. From the rise of electronic dance music and the dominance of rock, to the emergence of hip hop and the golden age of the music video, it was truly a decade that changed the face of popular music, and its influence continues to be felt today.
And on that note, it's time for us to sign off. Thanks for joining us on this musical journey through the 80s. Until next time, keep those 80s playlists pumping.
And don't forget to use that whammy bar. This is Oki Radio signing off.